Nolan Pierce lifted a champagne before the laughter had even finished. The sound spread under the amber lights of the executive lounge, thin and polished like cut glass, while the brass trio near the bar kept playing as if humiliation were just another note in the room. He stood a little straighter inside his tailored charcoal suit, one hand loose in his pocket, the other circling his flute as three senior managers leaned in around him. The room smelled of expensive cologne, oak smoke, and the citrus peel drifting off a row of untouched cocktails. On the wall behind them, a screen rotated through the company's quarterly wins, all sharp fonts and blue light, the kind of glow Nolan had started to believe belonged to men like him. Serena never understood this world, he said, letting her name fall with practiced ease, as if it were harmless. She liked the idea of success. The dinners, the photos, the zip code. But the work? The pressure? She folded every time. A woman from legal gave a sympathetic wince that was really curiosity. One of the VPs smirked into his drink. Nolan noticed both and fed them more. Some people are built to rise, he added, glancing toward the glass doors that led to the upper floor offices. Some people just attach themselves to whoever's climbing. He did not say ex-wife. He did not need to. Everyone in that circle knew enough. The divorce had traveled through the building months ago in lowered voices and elevator pauses. Dressed up as concern and traded like gossip always was in companies that pretended to be families. Serena had disappeared after that. No dramatic scenes. No legal mud in public. No pleading calls to reception. No awkward lunches nearby. Just gone. That silence had hardened into a story Nolan liked better than the truth. In his version, she had shrunk. In his version, she had become exactly what ambitious men warned each other about when they wanted to sound wise over bourbon, dead weight in good shoes. Across town, Serena's life looked nothing like the one he was selling. The apartment she now lived in sat above a quiet street lined with old brick and warm storefront light, where mornings smelled like espresso and rain drying on concrete. Her world had become smaller by design, not by defeat. A ceramic mug warming her hands by the window. A cream wool coat folded neatly over a chair. Fresh lilies on a narrow table, their pale scent clean and almost stern in the stillness. She had learned to prefer rooms where nobody asked who she used to be. Her phone lay face down beside a leather-bound planner, untouched while city headlights moved in silent bands across the floorboards. She was not in Nolan's orbit anymore, and that absence had become his evidence. Back in the lounge, Nolan laughed softly and tipped his head as if embarrassed by his own honesty. It was a careful performance, measured enough to sound wounded, confident enough to sound victorious. I tried, he said, for years. He paused just long enough for the lie to breathe. But you can't drag someone into a life they're too comfortable to earn. That word landed exactly where he wanted it to. Comfortable. Soft. Useless in silk. The men around him gave him the kind of nods that pass for respect in rooms where cruelty wears cufflinks. One clapped him on the shoulder. Another muttered, "At least you cut clean." Nolan accepted it all with the faintest shrug, as if surviving Serena had been one more burden he'd turned into discipline. And with every sentence, he gave the story a sharper edge, sanding himself into a self-made man and her into the cautionary footnote he believed she had become. Then his boss, Daniel Reeves, crossed the lounge with a tablet tucked under one arm, his shoes whispering over the dark carpet. He stopped beside Nolan's group and glanced around with the brisk focus of someone already thinking 3 meetings ahead. "Enjoy the breathing room while you can," Daniel said. "Board just confirmed the strategic dinner next week. Internal shortlist only. Senior leadership, select partners, and the CEO table." The circle tightened. Even the music seemed farther away. Daniel looked directly at Nolan. "If you want to be noticed, that's your shot." Nolan's smile did not move all at once. It sharpened. The champagne in his glass trembled once under the chandelier light, and he lifted it again, already seeing himself in a bigger room, under brighter lights, with more important people listening. "Trust me," he said, eyes fixed on his own reflection in the window glass. "I'll be ready." The low hum of the air conditioner pressed against the glass walls, and late afternoon light slid across the conference table in pale bars, turning every water glass into a blade. Fresh coffee had gone bitter on the sideboard. Daniel Reeves stood at the head of the room with a tablet in one hand and a stack of black envelopes in the other. His tie slightly loosened, his tone clipped with the kind of authority that made chairs straighten before people did. "This isn't a networking cocktail hour," he said, passing the envelopes down the table. "Next Thursday is the strategic dinner. 8th floor ballroom. Selected department heads, outside partners, and executive leadership." The matte paper landed in front of Nolan with a soft, expensive thud. Cream lettering. His name embossed in silver. Daniel's gaze moved around the room, then stopped on him again. "You'll be presenting the Westbridge numbers at your table. Keep it sharp. Keep it clean. The people in that room decide who gets moved up before HR ever drafts the memo." Something almost imperceptible changed in the air after that. Not excitement exactly. Pressure, maybe. The kind that made everyone sit a little stiller, the kind that smelled faintly of printer ink, dry wool, and ambition. Nolan turned the envelope over once in his hand, thumb brushing the seal. A week ago, he had only been one more well-dressed man in a profitable building. Now the night had edges. Now there would be witnesses. "Understood," he said, and even to himself his voice sounded smoother than it had a moment before. After the meeting broke, he didn't head back to his desk. He crossed the floor with deliberate calm, catching two colleagues near the windows where the city below flashed with 6 o'clock traffic and red brake lights. A junior analyst moved aside for him without being asked. Nolan placed the envelope on the ledge between them, letting the silver lettering show before lifting his coffee. CEO table in a room. One of them said, "Try not to sound impressed," and failing. Nolan gave a modest shrug that belonged to no honest emotion. "Daniel wants people who can carry a conversation without embarrassing the company." A few quiet laughs followed. He let them. Then he added, "A night like that separates people who belong in the room from the people who only ever held them back." The line was aimed nowhere and everywhere at once. One of the men glanced up, curious, already fishing for the story Nolan liked people to drag out of him. Nolan watched the reflection of the office lights in the window and gave them exactly enough. "Marriage teaches you that," he said. "If you spend years dragging someone who never understood momentum, eventually you either drown with them or cut the weight loose." He smiled into the rim of his cup before taking a sip. The coffee had gone lukewarm, but he drank it anyway. Daniel's announcement had done more than offer him a seat at a dinner. It had handed him a stage, a deadline, and a reason to start polishing the version of himself he wanted senior leadership to remember. By 7:30 that night, his apartment looked like a temporary war room. 2 suits lay across the bed under the amber light of a brass lamp. One charcoal, one midnight blue. He held ties against them in the mirror, stepping back, narrowing his eyes, adjusting the knot with careful fingers. His phone buzzed against the dresser. A message from a colleague. "Heard the dinner is tighter than usual this year. Real shot if you don't blow it." Nolan typed back immediately, "I don't intend to." Then he opened his laptop and pulled up executive bios, table assignments from prior events, the names of partner firms likely to attend. He made a list. Who mattered? Who influenced promotions? Who tended to drink too much and talk too freely after dessert? Who would remember a polished line about growth and resilience if delivered with the right smile? The city outside his windows had gone dark enough to turn the glass into a mirror. In it, his silhouette looked taller, cleaner, almost finished. On the dresser, the invitation caught the lamplight again. Nolan picked it up, slid a finger beneath the seal, and opened it fully at last. Inside was the schedule, valet instructions, dress code, and a final line printed at the bottom in discreet silver script. Executive spouses and invited guests to be received during the opening reception at 7 p.m. His eyes stopped there. For one still second, even the traffic noise below seemed to thin out. Then his mouth curved. A guest list meant optics. Optics meant comparison. Comparison meant opportunity. By the time he set the card back down, he had already decided how the evening would work. He would arrive early. He would own his table. He would let the right people hear the right version of his life. And if the past happened to wander near the light, he would make sure it looked small. Rain tapped softly against the window panes of Serena's apartment, turning the city outside into a wash of silver and blurred brake lights. Inside, the room carried the clean scent of steamed cotton and white tea, the kind of quiet that did not ask permission from anyone. Her dress hung from the bedroom door in a garment bag the color of deep smoke, untouched for the moment, while a slim, ivory envelope rested beside a crystal tray on the table. Serena stood barefoot on the hardwood floor, one hand around a warm mug, watching the rain gather and slide down the glass. When her phone lit up, she did not rush to it. She let it ring once, then lifted it. Damien Cross's voice came through low and even, softened by distance and traffic somewhere on his end. "I can have the car there at 6:30, he said. "Only if you still want to go." The question hung between them for a breath. Not because she doubted him, because accepting meant stepping back into a room where Nolan's name still moved easily, where his version of their marriage had likely already found polished shoes and sympathetic laughter. Serena crossed to the table and set down her mug. The porcelain clicked lightly against glass. "I said yes yesterday," she replied. "I'm not changing it tonight." On the other end, there was the faint rustle of paper, then a small pause that sounded almost like approval. Damien never filled silence, just to prove he owned it. That, more than the tailored suits or the private elevators or the drivers who opened doors before anyone reached for a handle, had unsettled her in the beginning. He moved like a man used to power but not hungry to display it. Months earlier, when they had signed their marriage license in a quiet courthouse with winter light on the stone steps and no photographers waiting outside, he had only looked at her with that same calm steadiness and said, "We don't owe an audience a beginning." She had kept her new ring turned inward for weeks after, the diamond hidden against her palm like a private decision still warming into truth. Now she turned it once with her thumb, feeling the cool edge catch the skin. "No one at the company knows?" she asked. "No one who needs to hear it from me has heard it," Damien said. "And I prefer it stays that way until we walk in." She glanced toward the garment bag. Through the half-open zipper, a sliver of dark silk showed itself under the lamp, almost black until the light found blue in it. "You want surprise," she said. "I want accuracy," he answered. A soft smile touched her mouth before she could stop it. Outside, a siren passed 3 streets away and vanished. "There's a difference?" "A large one." He let that settle, then added, "If Nolan has spent weeks building a story, let him bring it all the way into the room himself." Serena said nothing at first. Her free hand slid over the back of a dining chair, fingertips brushing the cool lacquered wood. In the kitchen, the kettle clicked as the last heat left the metal. This was not revenge in the shape Nolan would understand. No hidden dossier, no shouted confession, just timing and the simple cruelty of truth arriving after a man had already spoken too much. "You know what they'll say," she murmured, "that I married quickly, that I needed rescuing, that I traded one life for another." "Let them say it after they've met you," Damien replied. "Not me. You." The distinction landed cleanly. In Nolan's world, men framed the room and women were measured inside it. Damien, for all his reach, had never spoken to her as if she were an accessory to his name. Serena walked to the bedroom and unzipped the garment bag fully. The dress inside fell in a dark, liquid line, elegant without begging for notice. Beside it sat a velvet box she had left unopened since the afternoon it arrived. She lifted the lid now. A pair of understated diamond earrings caught the lamplight and gave it back in quiet sparks. Beneath them lay a handwritten note on thick cream stock for the opening reception. "No announcement before we enter. Let them meet my wife and the truth at the same time." Her gaze stayed on the last line, not because it was romantic, because it was exact. In another apartment across the city, Nolan was probably rehearsing himself in mirrors, polishing the edges of old contempt until it looked like wit. Here, there was no rehearsal left, only a choice. Serena took off the ring she had worn turned inward and set it carefully on the tray. Then she slid it back on with the stone facing out. When Damien spoke again, his voice was quieter. "If you want me to cancel, I will." She looked at her reflection in the dark window, layered over rain and city light, no longer hidden even from herself. "No," she said. "Send the car." The line ended a moment later. The apartment returned to stillness, but it was a different kind now, one that had already made room for impact. Serena lifted the earrings, placed them on the table beside the invitation, and reached for the dress. Across town, Nolan was preparing to control a story. At 6:30 tomorrow, he would walk into a room where it no longer belonged to him. Crystal chandeliers dripped white light across black glass and polished brass, and the ballroom carried that familiar blend of expensive cologne, warm hors d'oeuvres, and chilled air from vents set a little too low. Waiters moved between clusters of dark suits with silver trays balanced at shoulder height, while the low hum of networking kept rising and falling like a tide. Nolan Pierce entered that current as if it had been arranged for him. Daniel Reeves had given him a visible role, and he wore it carefully. Midnight tie, cufflinks that caught the light, a smile sharpened for the right people. Near the bar, between a senior operations director and two outside partners from Chicago, he began laying down the version of his life he wanted preserved. "Divorce was the best thing that ever happened to me," he said, taking a bourbon he barely touched. A few men chuckled on cue. Nolan leaned one elbow against the marble counter, relaxed enough to look honest. "Some people don't grow with you. You spend years dragging dead weight and calling it loyalty." The operations director gave him a sideways glance, curious now, and Nolan kept going because attention had opened in front of him like a door. He described Serena without using her name at first, reducing whole years to small, cutting details, the modest dinners, the old apartment, her dislike of corporate events, the way she had supposedly never understood ambition. Each line was polished to make him sound patient and burdened, the kind of man who had suffered quietly before finally choosing better. Laughter flickered again when he added, "She always thought stability was enough. I wasn't built for enough." One of the partners lifted his drink and said, "Well, looks like you upgraded." Nolan accepted that with a modest dip of the chin he had practiced in mirrors. Across the room, a jazz trio was turning standards into something soft and expensive, piano notes gliding under the clink of crystal. Daniel stood near the far end, greeting invitees, and every few minutes Nolan's eyes moved there, then back to his audience, measuring who was listening, who might repeat his words to the right table. So he made the story uglier. Not loud, never loud, just intimate enough to feel true. He said Serena had resented his long hours because she preferred comfort to progress. He said she had made every success feel like a betrayal. He said some people confuse being loved with being carried. One of the younger managers laughed too hard at that, and Nolan rewarded him with another story, this one even crueler for how casually he told it. A dinner bill counted too carefully, a dress he implied she wore too many times, a tone of voice that suggested she had belonged to a smaller life and had tried to trap him inside it. The circle around him tightened. Even the woman from investor relations, who did not laugh, stayed. That was enough for Nolan. He mistook stillness for agreement. He mistook silence for safety. By the time a server passed with seared scallops and rosemary steam curled briefly through the cold air, he was no longer defending his past. He was building a public record. "I used to think divorce meant failure," he said, rolling the bourbon once in his glass. "Turns out it was just correction." This time the laughter came faster, because now they understood the game. Not truth, but hierarchy. Not memory, but positioning. Daniel was still occupied at the entrance. Senior executives were filtering in, and Nolan, seeing no resistance, feeling the approval settle around him like a custom jacket, took the last step that mattered. He named her. Serena had no place in a room like this, he said. She would have hated everything about tonight. Honestly, if she saw this crowd now, she'd probably feel exactly what she always was, out of her depth. The sentence landed cleanly. A few smiles held. Someone exhaled through his nose. The woman from investor relations finally looked away, not toward Nolan, but toward the entrance behind him, where the room's noise had shifted by half a degree. Nolan didn't notice. He was still watching the faces in front of him, waiting for the next laugh, not understanding that he had just moved beyond office gossip into something harder, brighter, and impossible to gather back once spoken aloud. A low ripple moved through the ballroom first, subtle as silk dragged over carpet. Glass touched glass somewhere near the bar. The string quartet kept playing, but a few notes seemed to thin out beneath the hum of voices and the buttery glow of wall sconces reflected in black marble. At the far end of the room, one of the double doors had opened, letting in a draft of cooler air from the hotel corridor and a clean trace of rain-damp night. Nolan was still angled toward his audience when the shift reached him. Not the sound exactly, the absence of it. He turned half a beat too late. Serena stood just inside the threshold, as if the room had been built to receive her. The deep green of her dress caught the chandelier light and held it. Not flashy, not pleading, just precise. The fabric skimmed cleanly as she moved, and the diamond at her throat answered each step with a small, hard glint. Her hair was pinned back in a way that showed the line of her neck. One hand rested lightly at her side, the other holding a small satin clutch, and on the finger Nolan used to watch across cheap dinner tables and rent checks in years he had already revised into a joke. A ring flashed once and disappeared into the light again. She did not search for him right away. That was the first thing that unsettled him. She paused to greet the woman at registration with a quiet smile, then offered her invitation card with the ease of someone who had never once doubted she belonged in a room full of polished shoes and strategic laughter. The woman from Investor Relations, the same one who had looked away when Nolan made the room laugh, straightened almost involuntarily. A man from Compliance lowered his drink. Near the center table, one of the outside partners glanced from Serena to Nolan and back again, his expression changing by degrees, amusement first, then calculation. Nolan felt his mouth hold the shape of his last smile a second too long. "Well," he said, a little louder than necessary, smoothing the front of his jacket with his palm, "look who finally found her way into a room like this." A few people gave him the courtesy of a soft chuckle, but the sound came late and died fast. Serena's eyes found him then. No flinch, no pli, no flicker of the old reflex he used to provoke and then call instability. She crossed the room at an unhurried pace, the hem of her dress whispering over the carpet, the scent of something cool and expensive, white tea, maybe, or clean linen, arriving a second before she did. Nolan had spent the last hour turning her into a smaller version of herself. The woman approaching him made those sentences feel suddenly cheap, like plastic left under chandelier light. Daniel Reeves, stationed closer to the entrance now as more senior guests arrived, noticed her too. His posture shifted. Not fully, not yet, but enough. Enough for Nolan to see it. Enough for the room to register that this was no accident guest wandering into the wrong event. "Serena," Nolan said, try for the old tone, the one that turned correction into charm. "Didn't expect this crowd to be your thing." She stopped at a measured distance, close enough for him to see the calm in her face and the faint reflection of crystal light along the edge of her earring. "Good evening, Nolan," she said. Nothing more. No defense. No invitation for another performance. The sentence landed with the softness of velvet and the weight of a locked door. He gave a short laugh through his nose and looked around, as if the room were still his to conduct. "You clean up well," he said. "I guess anyone can look the part for one night." There it was, his hand reaching again for the same weapon, even as it dulled in his grip. But now the cost had changed. Before, he had been spending her dignity as if it were still available to him. With Serena standing there, poised, composed, visibly at ease in the very place he had used to erase her, every new word threatened his own balance instead. Around them, conversations had not resumed. They had frozen in place. Ice clicked faintly in a highball glass. Someone's phone screen went dark against a linen napkin. Serena tilted her head just slightly, not in submission, not in challenge, simply acknowledging that she had heard him and found no reason to carry his bitterness for him anymore. Nolan's jaw tightened. He could feel the room revising him in real time. Then, from the entrance, Daniel took 2 steps forward with the polished urgency reserved for people who mattered, and the staff near the door straightened as another guest arrived. Nolan followed the movement instinctively, still trying to stand inside his own story. Serena did not look away from him. She only adjusted the satin clutch in her hand and waited, while the room prepared to reveal whether she had entered alone. Crystal trembled softly somewhere near the bar, and the scent of citrus peel lifted above the warmer notes of wine and polished wood. At the entrance, a coat was handed off, a dark overcoat disappearing into white-gloved hands, and Daniel Reeves's posture changed again, straighter, quicker, almost deferential. Only then did Damien Cross step fully into the light. He did not arrive with noise. No raised voice, no theatrical pause. Just a tall man in a black dinner jacket cut so precisely it seemed to sharpen the air around him, his cuff links catching the chandelier glow for a second before he crossed the marble threshold. Serena turned at the exact moment he reached her, as if the room had been waiting for that single movement. He stopped beside her, close enough that their shoulders nearly aligned, and with one small gesture, 2 fingers at the small of her back, familiar and unhurried, he altered the shape of the evening. Nolan saw it. He saw Daniel offer a hand first, saw 2 senior directors angle themselves half a step nearer, saw one of the outside partners' smiles tighten into recognition. But the meaning still failed to land. Not fully. Not yet. So he reached for the version of the world that had always served him best, the one where appearances could be mocked before they became threats. He gave a short laugh, too crisp to be natural. "Well," he said, lifting his glass without drinking, "that answers that." A few people looked at him. Fewer smiled this time. Nolan kept going anyway, because silence had started to feel dangerous. "Good for you, Serena. Really. Nice recovery." The word recovery hung in the chilled air between the piano notes. Serena did not flinch. Damien only turned his head slightly, studying Nolan with the mild attention one might give a stranger who had interrupted a private table. That calm unsettled Nolan more than anger would have. He adjusted his jacket, forcing ease into his shoulders. "I mean, everyone lands somewhere," he added. "Some people rebuild. Some people just marry well." A woman near the floral arrangement looked down at her champagne. One of Nolan's co-workers, who had laughed 10 minutes earlier, shifted his weight and said nothing at all. Serena's emerald silk caught the light when she moved her hand, and the ring on her finger flashed once, clean and undeniable. Still, Nolan chose not to read it correctly. He leaned into the misunderstanding because it was the last place where he still sounded superior. "No shame in it," he said, smiling at Damien now, as if inviting him into the joke. "Life's expensive, especially for people who always liked nice things more than hard work." Daniel's expression went flat. A server passing with a tray slowed, then carefully continued on. Damien took the glass of sparkling water offered by another staff member, thanked him quietly, and only then looked back at Nolan. There was nothing heated in his face, nothing that could be called defense, which somehow stripped Nolan's performance of its balance. The insult had been thrown, but it had not found a target willing to catch it. Nolan mistook that restraint for weakness. He took one step closer, lowering his voice just enough to make others lean in. "You should know," he said to Damien. "She was always good at looking composed after making a mess of things. It's kind of her gift." Serena finally moved, not backward, not toward Nolan, but toward Damien. Her hand rose with complete certainty and settled at his wrist, light against black wool, intimate in a way no explanation could soften. Damien looked down at her for a fraction of a second, and the formality in his face eased into something unmistakably private. Around them, the room tightened. Nolan's smile remained in place a beat too long, then began to slip at the edges. He had wanted to reclaim the floor by making Serena seem dependent, ornamental, attached to borrowed power. Instead, every word was starting to make him sound smaller beside a man who had not needed to announce himself once. Near the front of the ballroom, the event host reached for the microphone. Daniel turned toward the stage at once. So did the senior staff. Damien's name was still unspoken, but the room had begun arranging itself around him, and for the first time that night, Nolan's grip on his glass looked less like confidence than something keeping his hand from shaking. The microphone gave a brief, soft pop, and the low hum of conversation folded in on itself beneath the chandeliers. Glass caught amber light across the ballroom, scattering it over black jackets, polished shoes, and the white linen laid out with military precision. At the front, the host adjusted his cuff, smiled toward the senior table, and waited just long enough for every wandering gaze to settle. Serena felt Damien's stillness beside her before he moved. Nolan was only a few feet away, one hand around his drink, the last trace of his smirk hanging there as if it hadn't yet realized the room had changed owners. Before dinner begins, the host said, voice warm and amplified, "We'd like to recognize a few of the leaders shaping the next phase of the company." A server passed carrying silver trays fragrant with rosemary and butter, but no one reached for anything now. Daniel Reeves had already straightened, chin lowered with the kind of reflexive respect that doesn't need instruction. One by one, names were introduced, each followed by polite applause. Then the host turned slightly, his smile sharpening with real deference. "And of course, Mr. Damien Cross." The reaction was different this time. Not courtesy, not routine. The sound that moved through the room was immediate and fuller. Chairs shifting, hands coming together harder, several department heads angling their bodies toward the stage without thinking. Damien released a slow breath and stepped forward, the black wool of his dinner jacket catching a dull sheen under the lights. Nolan's fingers tightened around the glass. For the first second, confusion still protected him. Then Daniel himself crossed the space to greet Damien with an outstretched hand and a nod too respectful to be misread. "Good to have you here, sir," he said, loud enough for those nearest to hear. "Sir." The word landed with more force than the applause had. Damien accepted the handshake, then turned, not to the stage first, not to Daniel, not to any of the executives orbiting him, but back toward Serena. The green of her dress deepened under the chandelier light, emerald against cream and gold, and the diamond on her left hand flashed once as she lifted her chin. Damien offered his arm with no performance in it, only certainty. She took it. Nolan's mouth parted slightly, then closed again. The host glanced down at his card, then up at Serena with the careful politeness reserved for someone whose place had just become very important. "And joining Mr. Cross this evening," he said, "is his wife, Serena Cross." The silence that followed was not empty. It was packed tight, airless listening. Somewhere near the back, a fork struck porcelain with a tiny, bright click. A woman who had laughed at Nolan's story less than 10 minutes ago let out a breath through parted lips and looked at him as though she were revising a document in real time. Serena didn't wave. She didn't hide. She simply stood beside Damien, wedding ring visible, posture easy, as if this truth had never needed defending. Nolan's face lost color in uneven stages, first around the mouth, then under the eyes. He looked from Serena to Damien, then to Daniel, and in that frantic little triangle the memory of his own words seemed to arrive back at him all at once. Dependent, ornamental, married well, burden. Damien's gaze found him then, calm and level. Not angry. Worse than angry. Precise. Nolan tried to recover with a laugh that scraped on the way out. I didn't realize," he said, but the sentence came apart before it could become anything useful. No one stepped in to rescue it. The room had already made its decision. The people who had leaned toward him earlier now leaned away by inches, enough to be felt. Daniel's expression hardened into something corporate and cold, the kind of look that begins writing consequences before a word is spoken. Damien finally addressed the room, his voice even, unhurried, carrying without strain. "My wife prefers privacy," he said. "I value that, but I don't let disrespect stand when it's offered so freely." He did not raise his tone. He did not need to. Every syllable traveled clean through crystal light and expensive perfume and the faint metallic tang of ice melting in untouched glasses. Serena kept her hand on his arm, not to steady herself, but to say without saying that she needed no shielding, only truth. Nolan swallowed, set his drink down too fast, and the bass clicked sharply against the bar top. A few heads turned at the sound, then back to him, waiting. The humiliation was no longer private gossip tossed over cocktails. It had become a public ledger, and his own voice had filled in every line. Damien looked once toward Daniel, and Daniel gave the smallest nod, already understanding that the evening had split into a before and an after. Nolan stood in the center of that divide with nowhere left to place his eyes, while Serena, beside the man he was required to answer to, remained perfectly still. And when Daniel took one step toward Nolan, the temperature in the room seemed to drop another 5 degrees. Crystal light trembled across the ballroom glassware, breaking into pale shards over white linen and polished silver, while somewhere near the back a waiter's tray gave off a thin, nervous rattle. The air smelled of citrus peel, chilled champagne, and expensive cologne that suddenly seemed too sharp, too crowded, as if the room itself had begun to recoil. Daniel Reeves did not raise his voice when he reached Nolan, but the silence around them tightened so completely that even the low jazz from the string quartet near the stage felt distant, muffled behind a wall of heat and blood. Nolan tried to smile before Daniel even spoke. It came out stiff, a pulled thread of an expression that died at one corner of his mouth. "My office," Daniel said quietly, then let his eyes move once towards Serena and Damien before returning to Nolan. "No, not later. Now." A minute earlier, Nolan had still been standing inside the shape of his own story, the one he had built with smirks and little half-truths over whiskey and laughter. Serena was difficult. Serena was deadweight. Serena had held him back. But the room had turned on a hinge, and now every sentence he had tossed so carelessly seemed to hang in the air with his name attached to it like signed paperwork. One of the regional directors, a man who had laughed loudest at the bar, suddenly found something fascinating in the condensation sliding down his glass. Another took a subtle step away from Nolan, then another, creating just enough space to be noticed. Even the woman from investor relations who had been nodding along earlier lowered her gaze when Serena's emerald dress caught the chandelier light again. No one wanted to be standing too close to the wreckage. Nolan opened his mouth, closed it, then reached for Daniel's sleeve with fingers that missed the fabric the first time. "I didn't know," he said, too fast, the words scraping dry. "Sir, if I had known." Daniel's face changed almost imperceptibly, not angrier, just colder, more administrative, the kind of cold that moved numbers off a roster and key cards out of systems by morning. "That," he said, "is not helping you." The sentence landed harder than a public rebuke would have. Across the room, Serena had not shifted an inch. Her ring flashed once as she accepted a glass of sparkling water from a passing server, untouched condensation beating against her fingertips. She did not rescue Nolan by looking away. She did not punish him by staring him down. She simply remained where truth had placed her, beside Damien, while other people finished the work his own voice had started. Nolan looked toward the cluster of colleagues he had spent the last year trying to impress. Their body language answered before their mouths did. One man checked his phone with frantic concentration. Another gave Nolan a clipped nod that felt less like support than distancing. A client from Chicago, broad-shouldered and silver-haired, murmured something to his wife, and both of them turned their attention fully toward Damien instead. The hierarchy of the room had redrawn itself in seconds, and Nolan was no longer climbing it. He was sliding down it in patent leather shoes. He tried one last time, this time toward Damien, stepping forward with the desperate politeness of someone trying to stop a door from shutting. "Mr. Cross, I owe you and your wife an apology. I was misinformed. I was speaking casually." Damien looked at him with the stillness of a man who did not need volume to establish consequence. The black dinner jacket sat clean and severe on his shoulders. Even the folded white pocket square seemed sharper than Nolan's entire defense. "You were speaking freely," Damien said. "That's the problem." Nolan's throat worked. A pulse jumped at his temple. Around them, conversation had resumed in fragments, but only at the edges, in whispers thin as torn silk. Nobody was laughing now. Serena lifted her glass, took a small sip, and let the silence stand exactly where it belonged. That calm undid him more thoroughly than anger could have. If she had snapped, if Damien had humiliated him outright, Nolan might have found somewhere to place his own indignation. But there was nowhere to set it down. No attack to answer. No cruelty to point at. Only witnesses, memory, and a professional future shrinking in real time. Daniel extended a hand. Not an invitation, but instruction, directing Nolan toward the corridor beyond the ballroom, where the carpet darkened and the music thinned. Nolan hesitated, glancing once more at the crowd, at the people already recalculating whether his name should remain attached to projects, meetings, recommendations. When he finally moved, it was with the careful stiffness of a man who had just realized reputation made no sound when it cracked. Behind him, crystal chimed softly as someone set down a glass. Ahead of him, the corridor waited in cooler air and cleaner light. And just before he crossed out of the room, Daniel said, low enough for only Nolan to hear, "You're going to explain every conversation you've had about her tonight." Cooler air gathered in the corridor like water and stone, carrying the faint scent of polished wood and old citrus cleaner, while the ballroom music thinned behind the closed doors into a distant, muffled pulse. Daniel stopped beside a narrow console table under a brass sconce and waited, his face set in the hard, administrative calm of a man already thinking in paperwork, not conversation. Nolan opened his mouth once, shut it, then dragged a hand across his tie, as if loosening fabric might loosen consequence. At the far end of the corridor, the doors parted again with a hush of hinges and soft carpeted steps. Serena did not hurry. The deep emerald of her dress caught the low light and held it. Damien walked half a pace beside her, then stopped when she lightly touched his sleeve, a small gesture that changed everything because this time the next move was hers alone. Daniel straightened as she approached. Nolan turned fully toward her, and whatever apology had been forming in him lost its shape at the sight of her standing there without anger, without triumph, without any visible need to use the damage already unfolding around him. The silence pressed harder than outrage could have. Somewhere behind the doors, glass met glass with a bright, distant chime. "Serena," Nolan said, and even his own voice seemed startled by how thin it sounded in the cooler hall. "I didn't know." Damien's gaze did not sharpen. It settled. That made it worse. Daniel said nothing. Serena looked at Nolan the way people look at a room they once lived in after the furniture has been removed, recognizing it, but no longer belonging to it. "That," she said softly, "has never been the important part." Nolan blinked, thrown not by volume, but by the complete lack of it. He tried again, words coming faster now, shoes shifting against the runner, cuff brushing the edge of the console table. "If I'd known who," Damien cut in with quiet precision. "You knew who she was." The sentence landed cleanly. No raised voice. No lecture. Just fact. Nolan's throat moved. For a second, the corridor held only the hum of conditioned air and the faint rustle of Serena's dress as she adjusted her stance. Then she gave Nolan the only thing he had not managed to give her when it mattered: clarity. "You think tonight hurts because I married someone powerful," she said. "It hurts because you still believe value only counts when another man confirms it." The brass light above them threw a warm rim along her hair, but her expression remained still, almost tender in its finality. "Back then, you called my quietness weakness. You called my loyalty dependence. You called every sacrifice inconvenience because it came from someone you had already decided to stand above." Nolan looked down, then back up too quickly, as if searching for one version of her that still fit the stories he had told in rooms like this. There wasn't one. The woman in front of him needed nothing from his understanding now, and that absence stripped away the last illusion that this moment could be negotiated into something smaller. Daniel folded his hands in front of him, waiting. Damien remained where Serena had left him, present, steady, but not rescuing her, not speaking over her, not turning her reckoning into his. Serena took one small step closer, close enough for Nolan to catch the clean trace of her perfume beneath the cool hallway air, close enough for him to hear every word without the shelter of distance. "The hardest part for you won't be that I moved on," she said. It's that you never knew what you had while you were busy proving you deserved better. Nothing in the corridor moved for a beat. Nolan's shoulders lowered by an inch, not in relief, but in surrender to something he could not argue with because it had already been proven by his own mouth, his own choices, his own audience. Serena held his gaze only long enough to let the truth finish its work. Then she turned, the silk at her hem, whispering over carpet, and offered her hand to Damien. He took it without flourish. Daniel stepped aside for them first, an instinctive deference that said more than ceremony ever could. As they walked back toward the ballroom doors, warmer lights spilled across the hall and wrapped around them in gold. Behind them, Daniel's voice returned at last, low and official, directing Nolan toward the next room, the next conversation, the next cost. Serena did not look back. She had not come to win him over, speak louder than him, or leave him ruined by force. She had simply stood in the full shape of her life until his version of her could no longer survive the light.